Make no mistake, I love taking care of the elderly. I was adopted and raised well by an elderly couple. The onset of dementia on Mr. Perkins was what spurred me to become a nurse. I found a steady job as the consulting head nurse of a senior home. Whereas fate would have it, my adoptive parents, Mr. and Mrs. Perkins, came to, and it was my turn to take care of them. I found joy in my work, though at times it does make me feel like it isn't financially rewarding. Until Mr. and Mrs. Perkins passed away, one a couple hours after the other, people gushed and whispered about a love story so pure and sweet and eternal that they went together, hand in hand, onto the afterlife, where they were together forever, for all of time. But it was nothing but pure pain for me. I didn't have much in life except for them. In my grief, I resigned from my post, foolishly started a business that was in no way related to my skills. Needless to say, I failed. Investments went out the window, my business closed down even before it truly began, and I was facing bankruptcy within months. I knew no other trade. That's when I dared my old profession and flew overseas to become a in-house nurse to the elderly whose families opted out of nursing homes. The job was more strenuous, but the rewards were much more fulfilling. Aside from getting a paycheck that contained 2 more zeros than my previous job had to offer, I found a renewed purpose, continuing to my old life, long passion, caring for the elderly. And all along, I believed that would never change. At least, that was before I met Mrs. Keller. The Keller family has a vast fortune. They had a private property that stretched miles upon miles in one of the more inconspicuous rural towns of Germany. It was said that in the olden times, you needed 2 days to walk around the perimeter of the place. At the heart of this property sat the family manor, and that was where my life with Mrs. Keller began. I have had considerable experience with being an in-house nurse that time, but Mrs. Keller's case was an entirely different one. Mrs. Keller was a small, frail lady in her late 80s, but who looked like she was in her hundreds. She was built like a bird, thin and lightweight, and her wrinkled skin always had this deathly pale look to it, no matter what time of the year it was. She had a beaky nose, long candle-like fingers, and white hair. But perhaps the most distinguishing feature of her were her eyes. Clear electric blue eyes that looked like they belonged to a mannequin more than a human. The first few days were normal enough. We were the only ones in the 5-story manor, with about a dozen servants for the upkeep of the fairly ancient building. But I was the only one who actually had directly interacted with Mrs. Keller. Mrs. Keller was a quiet woman. She'd sit on her rocking chair by the balcony as she stared out into the woods of her property. Her diet was mainly of mashed potatoes and water, and she would feed on nothing else. The isolation in the manor was quite eerie, but it was not unbearable until Mrs. Keller began to behave erratically. She'd sit on her rocking chair, carrying out a conversation all by herself. Now, most elderly people her age suffering from dementia rarely speak with coherence, but she was. Somehow she was. Alternating between fluent German and English. I had asked her once who she was talking to. She just smiled toothlessly and replied with a curt shake of her head, When asked what they were talking about, she said, "They're saying it's my turn now. I'm renegotiating with them." Then the arguments began. She'd shout at no one in particular and then plead and cry not soon after. Again, such behavior was not new to me. I have had patients who displayed behaviors much worse. It was around this time that I learned from the house servants that this behavior had been going on for a long time now. It was mainly the reason why the Keller family did not bring their matriarch to a home. She was far too disturbing. Later, I found myself at rest more when Mrs. Keller was making a racket. Noisy Mrs. Keller and her invisible companions were unsettling, but quiet Mrs. Keller was downright frightening. I chanced upon an afternoon where Mrs. Keller was not in her rocking chair. Now that was unusual, even more so than her imagined conversations. I searched the entire floor to find her in the ancient bathroom, with pliers on her gums. She had tugged so hard, she skinned her gums raw. "Mrs. Keller, what are you doing?" I scolded her in the voice of a preschool teacher telling of a bully. "I need to grow my teeth back," she responded. "What?" I snapped at her, wrestling the pliers out of her abnormally firm grip. "I need teeth. They said it's my turn, and I need teeth." Mrs. Keller. But she did not let me finish. With a dismissive look, Mrs. Keller simply spat on the sink, teetering away, cursing in angry German. The next occurrence happened at night. My heart almost leaped out of my chest when I woke to see Mrs. Keller's face merely inches from mine, her clear electric blue eyes staring at me in the dark. She was standing beside my bed, stooping over. Then she drew herself back and forth, slowly but consistently, remaining steady on her feet. It was as if she was mimicking the motion of her rocking chair with her upper body. When I calmed down and finally found the sense to guide her back to her room, Mrs. Keller just went and left, as if nothing happened. This happened repeatedly over several nights. At times, she simply stared and refused to move, and that was just the beginning. She imposed a strict mashed potatoes diet only over the household. The servants, afraid of losing their jobs, complied out of fear. I did too, but out of concern for the old woman. At least that's what I told myself when she began creepy rituals such as spraying sheep blood all over the doors and windows of the manor, or locking us all in the manor once the sun began to set. No one would say it aloud, but we were all captives to this old crazy woman. I really wanted to quit, and I had actually notified the family about my intentions. The call was short and to the point. They merely added another zero to the end of my paycheck. They knew I needed the money, and so I stayed. Once I tried to sneak out to meet this single dad guy on Tinder. I made sure to tuck Mrs. Keller in before tiptoeing downstairs. The manor was quiet, vacated, for the servants knew better than to wake a slumbering, mad lady. I eased the iron bar off the door and cautiously stepped out into the night. Mrs. Keller was waiting by the doorsteps, hunting rifle in hand. It took all I had in me not to scream. "Where are you going?" she asked in a whimsy voice of an 80-year-old, but with the innocence of an 8-year-old. "Mrs. Keller," I gasped. I was just, "Where are you going?" It was not a question anymore. It was a scream. I lost the feeling in my legs as I collapsed to the ground. "Where are you going?" she repeated, screaming over and over until I was reduced to a whimpering, shaking ball on the ground. It took all night for us to shake the rifle off her hands. It was loaded with real rounds. She was prepared to shoot me. The morning after, I scaredly approached Mrs. Keller's room. It took all of a second for me to realize what was wrong, driving my doubt instantly out of my mind. First was the silence. Mrs. Keller was never quiet. Second was the smell of blood. I found her crouched on the bathroom tiles, feasting on rats, live rats. Her clear electric blue eyes stared at me, silently weeping as she devoured the rodent's mangled flesh. "Mrs. Keller?" I asked, all fear and uncertainty vivid in my voice. It was a wonder why I didn't run out of that house right then and there. She bit down again as she wept quietly. "They wanted to eat me. They said it was my turn." I tried to pry off the small animal's carcass, but she proceeded to claw at my face. I wept alongside her as I crouched down, observing the old woman in front of me. She was weak and trembling, but her eyes were alive and furious. "Mrs. Keller, tell me what I can do to help you," I said, my voice hollow, weak. I was helpless. I didn't know what to do. She stared at me while chewing. "You can take my place." Mrs. Keller's unsettling behavior only intensified. I had barged into all the rooms in the manor when I woke up one day and found her missing. We were about to notify the family and the local police when I saw Mrs. Keller out in the woods, running, not the feeble jog or walk that most senior citizens can only manage. This was the sprint of a Olympic qualifier. It made me queasy to watch her run from the woods across the fields with this maniac laughter in her throat. "You'll never catch me, you'll never catch me," she taunted, the wind behind her. When I asked who she was running away from, she merely shrugged and pointed to the woods. Them. I had all but given up. I had barely even seen Mrs. Keller for the past few days. She was just there on her rocking chair, having her arguments, drinking her own piss. I had tried quitting. I wanted to quit, but I felt like if I gave up on Mrs. Keller now, I'd have lost my adoptive parents again somehow. I found myself crouching before her as she sat on her rocking chair staring into the woods. That day was one of her calmer days, and it relieved me greatly. I placed my hand over her wrist as I stared into those clear eyes. I felt that something was wrong, but then again, what wasn't? "Mrs. Keller, what do I do now?" I asked, aware of how childish I sound. "I don't know how to take care of you, and yet they're here, always here." "Who are there, Mrs. Keller? Please just tell me." Her clear gaze shifted towards me. The old woman was shaking, her voice was shaking, but those eyes were steady. "I owe them a lot, child. Now they're saying it's my turn." But her eyes began to water and I braced myself for her wailing. But then she burst into laughter. Raucous, harsh. It was not the laughter you'd hear from an 80-year-old woman. The foreboding sense just intensified. sending the hair on the back of my neck to stand. "They think they can get me, but they can't," she sneered, her eyes glinting like a maniac. And then she whispered, "I'm already gone." I couldn't take it anymore. This was what freaked me out the most. The old woman was normal. There was no ear-to-ear grin, no blackened eyes, no crawling on the ceilings. I pacified myself over and over and over that she was just what I deemed as a regular old woman with severe dementia. But that's what makes her scarier and more dangerous. The fact that she's real. I was about to stand up, using the hand resting atop her wrist as my support. Mrs. Keller's gaze followed mine, but she did nothing. She just stared at me, her eyes flicking into the woods and back again. That was when I finally realized what was wrong. She had no pulse. The Mrs. Keller that returned was a living corpse. She had survived an open heart surgery and returned to the manor 2 weeks later. She was catatonic, barely leaving her rocking chair in that spot on the balcony where she overlooked the woods. Life at the manor was gradually returning to normal. I had began to settle down, internally berating myself for getting spooked and potentially discarding a well-paying job. But Mrs. Keller finally outdid herself. She began that day with shrieks and screams, which dissolved into sobs as she rocked herself on the chair. Her eyes darted frantically around her as she mumbled the words over and over again. "They're here. It's not my turn. They're here. It's not my turn. They're here. It's not my turn." It was sundown when she finally ran her throat dry enough she almost couldn't speak. And yet she mouthed wordlessly. I came to the 5th floor balcony with Mrs. Keller's dinner on my hands. I found it odd that her back was towards me. Usually it was angled a little to the side so she won't catch the glare of the sun. I approached and turned to face her. I dropped her dinner in shock. Mrs. Keller's eye sockets were empty, hollow, streaming blood. On each of her hands were her clear electric blue eyes. Perhaps the most disconcerting detail of all was that she remained calm, rocking herself back and forth in her chair. They were always around. I grew tired of them. I didn't want to see them anymore, she said in a hoarse whisper, but I was crying freely then. I had my hands over my mouth, unable to comprehend or react to what was happening. But they're still here. The old woman seethed. I can hear them. I was in shock. I took a step back as the old woman stood up. "They're not gonna get me," Mrs. Keller snarled. She walked with her arms aloft, her eyeballs on each open palm. "It's not my turn. Not now. Not ever." She walked on blindly, taking her tiny, unstable steps as she mumbled, "Not my turn. Not my turn. Not my turn." And with no warning, she sprinted off the balcony. The sickening thud was the last I heard before I passed out. The servants spoke of an old tale. They said it was way back during the time of the Holocaust. They said the Keller family was involved, but not as victims, but as the perpetrators. They said Mrs. Keller had enjoyed the killings far too much. She had even tortured some of the victims before slaughtering them, pulling their teeth, made them eat live animals, made them drink their own piss. They said the souls of her victims never left her. They haunted her through her entire lifetime, that the souls came for her at the end of her life and that she refused to accept that. It was now her turn. They said many things, but only one image was vivid in my mind. I regret ever returning to that place. I regret ever looking at that rocking chair again, for it was where she sat, tears of blood pouring down her empty eye sockets. She sat there, eyeballs in her palms, rocking her chair back and forth, as the souls condemned her, eating away at her skin and her teeth and her flesh and her bones for all of time.